Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. It's sort of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. It is the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online. I am Christina Hartlieb. I'm the executive director here. And tonight we have our ongoing discussion series about the Year of the Woman. And this particular topic is holiday entertaining with the Beecher sisters, those Martha Stewarts of the 19th century. It is, of course, an interesting time in, well, everybody's been, I'm sure, up all night and or listening to things all day. They're still counting votes, so that's just the way it goes in a democracy. You count the votes until they're all counted. So we'll see what happens, but welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. And we are in for an interesting and lively discussion. So I wanted to thank our series sponsor for this particular series, and that is Ann Ludwell and Associates. And I want to mention to everyone here that we are currently undergoing the exterior renovation of the house. And if you have not driven by, or if you have not looked at the pictures online on our restoration page, you will be shocked to see the front of the house because we have revealed the original facade. And they're working on paint stripping right now. So it is an exciting time. We are meeting with OHC and the construction guys weekly, and today I was dealing with water coming into the basement from power washing. So that being set aside, know that things are happening at the house, but tonight we are really ready for the discussion. So I will let John Getz and Kristen Renzi take it away, and you tell me what you want me to put on the screen for everyone.
How about the timeline first?
Okay, let's see. Here we go. So here is the timeline, and we will. You see that okay?
Looks good.
All right. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'll start by, as we usually do, by just hitting a couple of the highlights in the timeline here. Catherine, the first one, right? The first date, 1800, Catherine Beecher is born, the first child of Lyman Beecher, the famous Presbyterian preacher, the sort of Billy Graham of his era, and Roxana Foote Beecher, who interestingly came from an Episcopal family, not the Presbyterian family of her husband, but she was a loyal wife to him. So now that's important in reference to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was born 9 years later in 1811, the seventh child of Lyman and Roxana. So Catherine is her older sister, 11 years older, and that tells you something about the relationship between the two of them that would go on for the rest of their lives. If any of you have an older sibling who is 11 years older than you are, you may think that they've sometimes tried to run your life. And I think sometimes Harriet and her other siblings thought Catherine was trying to do that. And sadly, their mother died when Harriet was only 5 years old. And Lyman, the father, approached Catherine, his oldest child, and said, well, how would you like to be the mother of these kids? You got to kind of take over the domestic duties here. So she assumed that role at the age of 16. Harriet, her younger sister, only 5 at the time. Catherine, as far as we know, was engaged only once in 1822, and her fiance died at sea. She was pretty upset about that, as you might expect, and never married for the rest of her life. Catherine she was an educational reformer, and that's one thing, probably what she's best known for these days. And she founded the Hartford Female Seminary, which Harriet would then attend eventually and even become a teacher there by the late 1820s. That's important because of the curriculum that they had. They did not believe that women should study frivolous subjects and just be kind of trained to be ornaments to the households they would adorn. They wanted the young women to study the same courses that men were studying at that time. So it was a rigorous curriculum, and one designed to produce very thoughtful people. An event occurred in the late 1820s at that school that's not on the list, but Catherine took the lead, and Harriet was part of this too, a teacher by then, in leading a protest over the removal of the Cherokee Native Americans, the Cherokee tribe to the west. They were already getting pressure the Cherokees were getting a lot of pressure because people wanted their lands, and this would eventually lead in the next decade to the Trail of Tears. But she was protesting that. They all were at that time. A lot of letter writing, circulating petitions, things like that. 1832 is an important date for the Beecher family in Cincinnati. That's when they moved here, and Lyman assumed the presidency of Lane Theological Seminary, just a couple of blocks away from the home from what is today the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Walnut Hills. Neither Catherine nor Harriet had to come with their father and the rest of the family because they were older. Harriet was 21 by this time, but they came because they wanted to found a school for young women in Cincinnati, and they did that downtown and lived downtown near that school for a while. Harriet also got married in 1836 to Calvin Stowe, a teacher at Lane. And 9 months later, their first kids were born, a pair of twins, in Harriet Beecher Stowe House. She would go on to have 5 more children, all but one of them born in Cincinnati. Not in Harriet Beecher Stowe House, but in the neighborhood where she and her husband lived. Yeah. By this time, Catherine's writing books. And one of the things she wrote in 1837 was an essay on slavery and abolitionism, in which she challenged the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Alexandra, saying that abolition was an anti-abolition book, really. She said, I'm against slavery, but I'm against abolition, and I'm certainly against women participating in abolition. She would have been a colonizationist at this point, a much more gradual approach to trying to deal with slavery. The selection that we read from Catherine is from 1841, a treatise on domestic economy for the use of young ladies at home and at school. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the texts. Skip down to 1851. Catherine is publishing, again, The True Remedy for the Wrongs of Woman. At this time, she's living with Harriet, so that Harriet can complete the writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In The True Remedy for the Wrongs of Women, she stresses the similarity between motherhood and teaching, and the teaching profession. She's generally associated with the notion of women's domesticity, women as homemakers, but she also saw a role for women as teachers, and in fact had been recruiting women to get trained as teachers and then go west to teach in places like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So that's her true remedy for the wrongs of women, is to be domestic and to be teachers. By the time we get down to 1865, Harriet has already had her blockbuster Uncle Tom's Cabin over a decade earlier. She's now publishing house and home papers and starts writing the Chimney Corner series in the Atlantic Monthly. The 2 selections we have from Harriet are from the Chimney Corner, 1865, 1866, and it got published as a book a little bit in 1868. The Chimney Corner ran originally in the Atlantic Monthly, then in book form. Something you need to know about that may have confused you if you read the selection. The narrator, Christopher Crowfield. It's a pseudonym for Harriet, basically. He's a spokesperson for her, and we could reflect in the discussion a little bit about using a male persona, a male voice for her to speak at that point. Other characters who show up are Bob Stevens, who is the Crowfields' son-in-law. He's married to their daughter, Mary Ann. So some of the dialogue in one of the stories that you read was Bob and Mary Ann play a role in that. Mary Ann's their daughter, Bob's their son-in-law. They continued to write together, and in The American Woman's Home in '69, and Catherine speaking out still on women's suffrage, and she was not a fan of women's suffrage and women's profession, and that was in 1871. So they wrote a lot of books, as you can see. There are several books about homemaking, tips for homemakers, and particularly with an angle of people who didn't have a lot of money. Sort of kind of like Martha Stewart's target audience to some extent. Decidedly middle class. You're not going to be able to do any of these things if you don't have very much money. But people they designed these books with an idea of helping women of limited means get the most out of their efforts and have the most success with their domestic life. So let me turn it over now to Kristen to start the discussion.
Hi, folks. So again, thanks for being here, and I'm happy to. We have a wide variety of different texts and things to discuss. I think our general plan was to start with the sisters' works, and then maybe move toward the end of our discussion toward the piece on Thanksgiving. But I really wanted to open by kind of thinking about ways in which reading this text might have struck you in particular ways based on the circumstances we find ourselves in collectively as a whole. So as you're reading about their suggestions for entertaining or other aspects of homemaking, about what a good party looks like, or the problems with parties in general, did you find any of these suggestions useful or helpful or even insightful, given that we're currently experiencing a pandemic in which our holidays are shaping up to potentially look very different than they have in the past for us?
So, Kristen, I'm just going to say first that I wanted people to kind of see the discussion questions, and if you want to take a picture of that or something that you can refer back to. But I'm going to take it off screen share here in just a second so that we can see each other as we're talking. So I just wanted to make that point. But in terms of holiday suggestions or entertaining, the entertaining part is going to be quite different this year. So in terms of anything that they could tell me that was helpful, I'm not so sure, but the no dancing thing was interesting, or the prescriptions against dancing. I don't know that we'll have much dancing going on at my house, but it'll be fun.
Great.
So.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thought?
Well, if I could offer, don't want to be the first one to say here, but I was very surprised at the readings myself. I was surprised because I found them extremely conservative. Of course, the years they were written, it makes more sense, and that they came from people women with religious backgrounds that may have had those views. I didn't know what the questions would be on focusing on COVID and the like, but underlying the whole thing also was this idea of being with friends instead of having an event that is phony. That came out more in the second reading than in the first reading, but I thought it was interesting, and I take it to heart that instead of showing off your friends with one another and not being close to one another and just putting an event on so you can have hors d'oeuvres and drink with one another and speak with nothingness with one another, her suggestions on how you should have smaller events with closer associations with people, I thought was very, very good. But I did find it's a little strange, the prohibitions against dancing. So.
No, thank you. Yeah, I too find these readings to be very conservative. Not necessarily surprising given what I know about these women, but they are certainly not sort of radical champions of equity in a way that we might want to think about today. But yeah, I think one of the things that struck me was this really clear delineation here between the people that you know and you need to keep up acquaintances with versus the people who you really know well, right? The kind of your small circle, your bubble, if you will, right? That you can have meaningful exchange with, that you don't even need to have performativity around, right? But like the kind of party that gets envisioned here where somebody might just be relaxing in the corner of the sofa and like sort of come into the conversation whenever they had felt moved to do so, but not feel like they had this performative dimension going on. It strikes me because my own social circle is so narrowly confined now in terms of people I see physically. But then I also have this like Facebook world where I see a lot of acquaintances regularly, but in much more superficial ways. So that was just a sort of immediate way in which I channeled some of this, some of these suggestions. And I too prefer my more immediate circle.
If I could just follow up with what you said, your Facebook friends, I find that my Zoom friends and my Zoom meetings with my friends have become much more intimate than they were when they began. We're more of a, okay, we can't get together, so we'll do this. But they've managed to become much more, I believe, much more intimate in their conversations and much more close. But, you know, that's, I don't have enough of them. So anyway, my comment.
No, that's great. To me, there is this one passage that's something else that's just on my mind, and this may be too much about who I am as a you know, sort of insular, quiet person. I sometimes have found myself worrying in recent months, like, what's happening to these friendships that I'm not regularly fueling in the same ways that I have in the past. There's this great quote, and this is in the How Shall We Entertain section. It's paragraph 177. Page 177. Real conversation presupposes intimate acquaintance. People must see each other often enough to wear off the rough bark and outside rind of commonplaces and conventionalities in which their real ideas are enwrapped, and give forth without reserve their innermost and best feelings. Sometimes I feel very bark encrusted indeed these days. So I liked that reminder. Other emotional reactions then that folks had, and we can weave in and out of their tips for entertaining as well. But what were your emotional reactions to these pieces, and or did you have them? For me, woman's fear was particularly galling in places.
Kristen, this is Sue, and I have to tell you that when I read it, it struck me like a bolt of lightning, because I have family that was obviously in Cincinnati at the time and a little bit further north. And the one thing with the dancing and everything else, because I've read the diaries and read everything and know the family history. I have one relative that was thrown out of the Quaker church, not once, not twice, but 3 times for teaching dancing. So when I saw the date on that, I looked and went, oh, it can't be that. And it was like, wow, that really is surprising from a Presbyterian church, that their view on not just dancing, but theater, and you have to understand anything connected with horses that didn't involve transportation, meaning, and people don't understand that the circus back then wasn't elephants and clowns, it was equestrian acts. And I found it very interesting that it seems to be a universal theme of conservatism. But then again, my relatives that this was applying to, they also came from Boston. And so I just kind of looked and went, huh, isn't that coincidental? So there's, I think, a deeper level that you have to look at, which is the community as a whole, and placing them in the context and realizing that there's something else going on here as far as how did you come up with, you know, you can't dance and, oh my gosh, well, you know, picking out and singling out horse racing in the circus. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting little gem from Cincinnati history.
Yeah. Yeah, there's I mean, so in the on domestic amusements and social duties, I'm interested in the sort of ways in which some of these things are seemingly outlawed, or not outlawed, but sort of held off. Issued.
Yeah.
Because not because they're necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but because of the ways that people have used them. Like, I think that's a really interesting logic. Like, theater might actually even be helpful for people, but generally it's not been.
Yeah,
so we're gonna set it to the side, right?
Yeah, it's one of where you see that same argument with women as soon as they start getting into forming the Women's Christian Temperance Union. There's this women's sphere, and women, you know, will save you from your sins. And you find that, you know, the Anti-Saloon League is the best example, that really the extreme of it. But it's this, you know, if you stay home, you're good friends, good company, keep a clean house, you know, you're a good person. And it's kind of, we scratch your head and go, and what exactly is that supposed to really get you? You know, you do all these things, and what's the reward? Because they never mention that. And that's what's really unusual. It's do all these things, but is it supposed to get you a good husband? Is it supposed to get you into heaven? You know, it's implied, but never really clearly said that, you know, this is what it takes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess they set out at the beginning of this piece, right, that you're supposed to be, that amusement is important as a form of recreation to strengthen your body, to invigorate your mind, and to help you actually do your duties with like a cheerier affect, right? It seems like, you know, the advice that we give people today, right? Like, do you feel like you have low energy? Then go exercise, go do something, because that will help, right? So in some ways they're tapping into kind of wisdom that we continue to pass. But at the same time, there's also this idea very clearly set out at the beginning that the only legitimate object of amusements is to prepare mind and body for the proper discharge of duty, right? So it's like within the sort of narrow constructs of, does this help you do your duty? Then good. But if it moves you into excess excitement, excess temptation, right? Then it's a problem. And this is again a kind of weird space, right, where it's actually being acknowledged that something like theater might be morally neutral, right? It's not necessarily bad. It actually could be good, but because engaging with it often leads people to do morally problematic things, then rather than blaming the people, let's just get theater off of the list of things.
Lead us not into temptation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these are the heirs of the Puritans. New
Well, that
England.
John is exactly what crossed my mind too, because on my side of the family, rather than the Beecher Stoves, I know that that's the direct lineage, and that's when you sort of look and you're like, huh, isn't that interesting? And you go back and start digging into what their foundation and their real beliefs were, and it wasn't quite what we've pictured it to be. You know, we have this image that a Puritan did this and a Pilgrim did that, and it's not necessarily true. Like, most people don't know there's a difference between the two groups.
And Lyman often got into trouble with the presbytery here in Cincinnati. They viewed him as too radical. And of course, his own kids were pushing the envelope further than he did, particularly Harriet. So I think you can really see in Catherine and Harriet, and we'll want to talk about some differences between them too as we go on. But I think you can definitely see the duty orientation that you're talking about, Kristen, in well, both of you in Catherine. I think there's certainly some of that in Harriet too, but I think she's also a little more willing to talk about the rights of women, not just their duties and responsibilities. And in her second piece, she even talks about the need for women to speak up about their rights. You can't really talk about responsibilities unless you start by talking about their rights too. Start with that, and I think that's a big step for her and for talking about women, and for them to be able to claim rights for themselves at that time was a pretty strong statement, I think, on Harriet's part. For Catherine, it's all duty, but I think Harriet's got a little more interest in what women have coming to them as their right, as their due.
Yeah, yes, but John, in the writing by Harriet, the second one I think you gave, where there's a dialogue between Bob and Martha. That is
Marianne.
Bob and Marianne. Marianne points out that women should be doing things that they would be skilled at. And she points out that the good thing for them to do would become nurses, and good thing for them to do would become teachers, and the good thing for them to do would become, we need to start universities that have home economics degrees. Now, this is 150 years ago, I know, but it seems to me that those were cataloging women into subservient positions. You know, that's how I would view it. I think most of us would view it today. But 150 years ago, that must have been radical. Right?
Well, I think she's trying to dignify the work that women do, and to say that it's worth studying. It's a science. It should be studied seriously. And that is her attempt, I think, to elevate the opinion of the work that women do. So yeah, I think that she's trying to, it doesn't seem like it to us, but I think there is an attempt here to try to make some claims on behalf of women and the work that they do, and to say, let's professionalize it. I think she's also talking about people who do domestic work, not just women, not just housewives, but people people who do this and as servants. Remember, there's a section in there about servants. We wish more women would see the dignity of this and actually take this work seriously. We demean it too much. That's her point. It shouldn't be looked down upon. It's important work. For her, really, it's the most important work. Taking care of children, instructing them. And that's where the teaching comes in. Both of these women were teachers, and both of them believe in a teacher's vocation as being really important and not inconsistent with a woman's work in the home.
Yeah, for me, I would say, like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Carrie. I know you were waiting to talk earlier.
I was going to say that like when I teach this time period, we talk about a lot of these, like the reform movements of the 30s and 40s as being, and I know some of this is going beyond that, but as women are choosing reform movements that connect to their domestic sphere, and it's not necessarily like them trying to stay subservient and to stay in the sphere, but to like start having some positions of authority, but doing it in a way that's going to cause less waves. And so like they're talking about these jobs that they have, which seem kind of like lesser to us today and not so like grand, but for them it was like the stepping stone. But I also earlier was thinking when we were talking about like how are they different or how are they the same, Catherine's writings are very like, I mean, kind of boring, and like she's just lecturing to you, whereas like Harriet, you know, she's a writer like and a novelist, and I don't know much about Catherine, but you know, if at 16 you become the mom to all your siblings, I would imagine that kind of took a lot of her, maybe her youthfulness out. But it seems like she's much more of a teacher lecturer, whereas Harriet likes to tell the stories.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair description, contrast between the two of them. Does she tell the stories well? I mean, they're long dialogues.
And she also tells the story from kind of all points of view. So by using the Christopher Crowfield character as her narrator, she really is able to talk about both the women's point of view, like, let's have this party, this is great, and the men's point of view, which was, there's going to be too many people in my house and it's going to cost too much and you're going to make me eat at midnight, which is bad for the digestion, and I'm not going to like that. And so the male perspective was just like all of these problems associated with having a party, whereas the female perspective was, let's have this party so that we can, you know, ingratiate ourselves with our friends. So it was like two different perspectives of what the party would mean.
I was gonna say, like one of the things that I find, you know, I feel very vexed when I read Woman's Sphere, because on the one hand, I find the essentialism and the claims that most women are naturally suited to be homemakers, to be incredibly frustrating and problematic, right? That like women are somehow oriented to dust and sweep and men are not, right? That makes me crazy. On the other hand, the idea of dignifying the very hard work of keeping a home up and running, that feels very good to me. And so there's this weird conundrum, right, where on the one hand, there are these claims made about what women are fitted to do. Although, again, she's very clear to make note that some women are, of course, exceptions to this, and it would be wrong to somehow like box them in and say, well, you'd make a great doctor, but you can't. You have to like sweep your house instead. But it's still like that's left as this exceptional space. But she also articulates the need for education regardless of whether you're going to be somebody who's primarily at home or primarily in the world, which I think is really interesting. And then I also just want to point out her at the very beginning of this. There's these three rights that she writes that all women should have. It's on 34. This is actually voiced by a man, I think. He says, there's certain neglected truths which have been held up by these reformers that are gradually being accepted and infused into the life of modern society. and their recognition will help to solidify and purify democratic institutions. They are: number 1, the right of every woman to hold independent property. Number 2, the right of every woman to receive equal pay with man for work which she does equally well. And 3, the right of any woman to do any work for which by her natural organization and talent she is peculiarly adapted. Man, we still don't have that number 2 down, right? We haven't been able to pass an equal rights amendment. It's been on the legislation for years. We have not ratified that amendment to the Constitution. And so, you know, like that's written about here is like, this is something we're all getting on board with, and yet we're still not on board with that apparently. You know, there are these radical moments in what's going on. They're slipped in certain ways.
Yeah, to me, that was one of the most powerful passages in any of this. She spells it right out, and I kept thinking of, you know, the whole equal pay for equal work, all of that stuff that we're still struggling with. And you made the point, Kristen, about when we were talking beforehand about the way the pandemic has particularly affected women. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So whenever we were talking beforehand about questions to ask, you know, I'm sort of interested in, are there ways in which we're still struggling on some of these key issues, and this idea of women entering a public sphere in some way, right, is really new in the 19th century. Although, again, the primacy is still placed on her role in the home and in the family. And through our pandemic experience thus far, we've seen a huge drop in women out of the labor force in particular, right? A lot of women have given up their jobs or have lost their jobs and are now taking on more primary role in the home. And that's just an interesting phenomenon to me. So I was wondering what people think about that. Why is it that if there are children who need to stay home and be educated from home, why is it so easy for us still to think, well, mom will do that, grandma will do that, female caretaker will do that, not dad will do that? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Actually, they've proved that some of that's incorrect as far as the number of women dropping out, especially because I've worked remote for most of the last 10 years. And, you know, I look at it and it's like you hear all these stories about this, and it's like most of us that have been doing it just shake our heads and laugh. It's why I don't put a picture up on Zoom because, frankly, no offense to everybody, when you do this all day, you really don't want to look at people. No offense. But there's a lot of stereotyping about it. You know, there's a lot of stereotyping about women's work outside of the house today as there was then. You know, somebody just made a comment about teaching and moving. This one relative of mine moved from Boston in 1808 to Oxford to finish an education and became a school teacher. And it's interesting because you have to sit there and say, well, why would they do that? What was going on? And we forget that Cincinnati in 1840, 1841 was a booming metropolis, and there are classes that divided people. And this is also Catherine's way of saying, elevate yourself, you're better than the underclasses. And so a lot of this right now is women have a way of martyring themselves and shooting themselves in their own feet. There's a book out there called Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office, and this addresses what women do to sabotage themselves in the workplace. And one right now is complaining about your children. You know, we all know it. If you go on mute and take care of it, none of us complain. But if you're going to put the drama on, then we do complain. And so it's a very interesting double-edged sword as to how women can advance themselves, but they can also shoot themselves in the foot. So it's during the pandemic, it's a lot of shrug your shoulders and go, well, you know, when the economic downturn hit in 2007, a lot of men became house husbands and didn't return to the workforce. And yet there's no comment about the house husbands taking care of the children today.
no, thank you for that. That's a helpful alternative perspective. So I've posted in the chat just an article from Time about sort of gender issues in the workforce and the pandemic. One thing that I'll say, just that obviously, I think what Susan is pointing out and what I'm hoping to point out too is, men and women are both equally able to work and also take care of their children. It seems though that those things have some differential impacts, even in terms of ways in which we talk about them or pay attention to them culturally or feel comfortable talking about them culturally. So certainly in my field, which is, I'm a professor, it is sort of has been well studied and documented that women who have children as professors slow down their career in terms of their promotion, whereas men who have children actually seem to speed up their careers in terms of promotion. Why that happens, we can make lots of hazards and guesses about, and people study that obviously, but that's an oddity, right? Why on the one hand would having a child hurt women and actually benefit men in terms of their career trajectory? Similarly, at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, almost all women, very few articles were being submitted to journals by women, much fewer than was regularly happening, particularly in sciences. So again, I think, these are things that people notice. We don't necessarily have good explanations for why they're going on, but it's something that people are interested in thinking about and interrogating to some extent.
I want to chime in if I can,
Mm-hmm.
as I have one sleeping beside me and the others have been in and out taking their baths and showers and stuff. So I feel like even though my husband is great, because if he wasn't, like, I couldn't do this in the evenings, like he takes care of our 3 kids anytime I'm doing this. And I would say that we have a very equal partnership, but I do feel like I have had the brunt of the, like, how are we going to take care of our kids during this pandemic while I'm teaching? And so I teach high school, for anybody who doesn't know. And so I worked from home in March and April and May with all 3 of my kids at home, and it was okay. Like, we made it. Carter, at that point he was 1.5. He got stuck in the deck door while I was on the phone with a parent, and I was like, sorry, like, I go pick him up. Like, I know that dads dealt with it, and I know that there are lots of dads who are dealing with it. But in my experiences at my school, and dealing with the parents, it seems like still, at least in my area, that women are the ones who are the ones juggling. The men are still, at least, again, in my circle, are able to go and work. And the women are trying to figure out, like, how to balance it. And so, it's been fine, but it was even mentioned at school one day, like, who has it really hard right now with the pandemic? Is it women? And I would say that in some cases it is, because it's almost like it's the whole issue again of, like, how to be good at everything. Like, how do I be a really good mom and spend time with my kids? But also, how do I be a good whatever my job is and spend time on that? Because being able to balance it all is so hard in a normal year, let alone in a pandemic year. So I understand that, like, in some cases, women don't help themselves out, and men are doing more. But I think still that idea of being a mom makes it harder.
Amy's had her hand up patiently for a while.
Thank you. I was just going to say, Thank you. Some of those issues we kind of discussed at the Semicolon Club when we just read a book called Invisible Women, which talks about unpaid women's work and how disproportionately women are caregivers and engaging not just nationally but internationally in unpaid work. So it was intriguing. There was a section, and Christina, please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a section that specifically addressed professors and tenure and how what happens for female professors is the time you're working on tenure is the same time you're in your prime ages for having children. So that's part of how that factors in. Yeah, so that just kind of struck me as part of this conversation as well. Although I will say, I talked with a colleague of mine. This was encouraging, very encouraging. She's on maternity leave right now, having had her second child. So I work in a library, and she was letting me know, like, she comes back on next week, and so she and her husband each have to work. So our library is partially working remotely, and so she's gonna be doing the caregiving when she's home remotely, which should be amusing. And then her husband is also working remotely, so he will be doing the caregiving while he's home remotely, so that for now they don't have to worry about childcare issues because their son is a little too young, since he's only a few months old, to go to childcare right now. So I was very proud of their arrangement to do that as equitably as possible. But they'll have two at home, so that should be very amusing to watch from afar.
No, thank you. And also thank you for the reminder, Christina. I forgot that we need to be watching participants for hands. Well, since we have just been experiencing an election, although maybe we did not experience polling places, curious about your thoughts about the way in which Harriet defends women's enfranchisement. Why should women get to vote? Well, of course, because it's basically logically correct, right? Like that's the argument here. But the objection, like, well, women, how can women go to polls? What do you think about this idea that polling places are this horror? John, you want to talk more about why polling places might legitimately have been a horror? Why this isn't just some sexist garbage?
Right. Well, we think there was certainly a lot of anxiety in the election we just had about, is there going to be terrible things going on at the polls? Well, if you had gone to vote in the time, the 1840s, 50s, or 60s, there would have been terrible things going on at the polls. Polling places were dangerous because there weren't any restrictions about space. You have to give people a certain amount of space to walk in. Nothing like that. In fact, there were all kinds of debates that would be going on. People would challenge you if you walked up, and you had to bring your own ballot. They didn't use government printed ballots at that point. You could have a ballot from a certain party. They started printing them up and handing them out, much as we do today, except that's just campaign literature. It's not actual ballots today. Well, they were in those days, where they could see you walking in with a ballot of a certain color and they know what party you were, and they didn't want you to vote. People got killed trying to vote. There's a statistic of 89 deaths occurred at polling places in the middle of the 19th century. Edgar Allan Poe may have died as a result of that. There's a story, or one of the theories about Poe's mysterious death in Baltimore is that people got a hold of him, some of the hooligans who operated for the political parties trying to round up votes, got him drunk, which wasn't very hard with Poe because he had this congenital sensitivity to alcohol, and just took him around to various polling places around town and kept voting him, having him fill out the ballots that they wanted. So it was not until 1896 that 39 of 45 states went to what was then called the Australian ballot, secret ballots. That was a big deal. They weren't secret before that. In fact, in Kentucky for a long time, you voted orally. You just said, hey, I like this guy, or I'm voting for him. And so everybody knew who you were voting for. So the notion of a secret ballot and also that the government would print those ballots and have them only there in the polling place. That was a new thing that wasn't really widespread in America until the 1890s. So these polling places were now. One article I read said they had an 80% turnout in the 1890s. We haven't approached anything like that since then. And they say because voting isn't as exciting anymore. Well, it kind of became exciting this year again. But since you just walked in and filled out a ballot, it didn't seem that thrilling to a lot of people. So if you really enjoy a lot of drama, go back and vote in the 1850s or 60s. So yes, this is not, and buying votes was very common. That was not made fully illegal until 1925. So you can pay people to go in and vote for the person you wanted them to. So yes, there was some reason for the hope that if women were granted the vote, they would kind of shape the voting places up a little bit, class them up, make them a little better place to go and vote. So yeah, there's an important context to that claim, I think.
Yeah, in general, I respond poorly to the 19th century claims around women's purification of men, although there is something to be said for maybe we would have started to take more precautions if our wives and daughters were going to polling places, not just ourselves, sons who presumably are immune to death and other kinds of bodily injury. Do we want to talk a little bit about the Thanksgiving article? I'm aware that we've set that off to the side, but I, for one, found it super fascinating, and I really want to get this book now, Silverman book. So I was wondering what thoughts folks had. Was any of this particularly revelatory information?
Just as a little introduction, it might be helpful to know that Philip Deloria is a Native American himself. He's a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and he's also a professor at Harvard. He was the first Harvard hire specializing in Native American lit. His father, Vine Deloria, was a famous scholar of Native American literature and culture, and also quite an activist. So that might help you to understand where this guy's coming from. He is a major scholar in Native American studies today. So yeah, what did you think of the article? What did you learn from it? Did it shock you, surprise you?
Well, I'll say that I certainly wasn't shocked. I never, when I taught history, I taught post-Reconstruction, so I never really got into that period as much. I knew that the first Thanksgiving was not the fairy tale type story that we tell elementary school students, but I hadn't really delved into the history of what it really was. So I'd have to say I wasn't surprised, but there were a lot of interesting details that it was like, well, okay, so it wasn't, coming together. It wasn't the difference between I don't remember how they called it, rejoicing versus Thanksgiving was interesting in terms of a real Thanksgiving would have been, no party and all prayer and so forth, whereas this was more of a let's have a party to celebrate what's going on. And oh, these guys are coming too? Okay. But I don't know. It was interesting information, but not shocking to me. Let's put it that way.
And the Wampanoags showed up only because they heard the gunfire that the Pilgrims were celebrating and thought maybe they were being attacked, and they were part of a military alliance, so they came to honor that alliance.
Yeah, that was a detail I did not know and found fascinating.
So somebody asked me in a discussion this morning, we weren't talking about this article, but where did our idea of Thanksgiving really come from? When did it become popular? Because they knew it probably wasn't, it didn't go all the way back directly to the Pilgrims. So what?
Hi, this is Elizabeth. So one of the things that I research is women's domestic history and domestic manuals, and there's a lot of talk about Thanksgiving in women's magazines of the time period. So I've read Godey's Ladies book, where Sarah Josepha Hale was the editor, the executive editor or head editor by the end of her career, and it's really interesting to read because in every single issue, she has an editorial about Thanksgiving around the time of the Civil War, and it's really interesting. I mean, the whole idea of Thanksgiving, the way we celebrate it today, is her idea. Really, it's American Civil War, dated back to American Civil War. The food that we eat is really a fancy Sunday dinner from the American Civil War era or 1850s. But it's also interesting in the sense that it's one of the earliest causes that a woman took up and championed that got adopted by the entire nation. In every single editorial, Hale is calling on her readers, mostly women, to write letters to President Lincoln and ask him to establish the fourth Thursday in November as Thanksgiving. And she does this she was doing this for years before he actually did it. But it's just that whole sort of campaign of hers is just really interesting to me, and that's where our American Thanksgiving comes from. It's a post Civil War thing. It's not from the Pilgrim era, and so that information in the article is not new to me, but it's just kind of interesting that we're looking at it from a totally different aspect now as being, culturally insensitive, which in 1850, it reflects that time period. And so it's just interesting to see the traces of that in our modern practice.
So it kind of sounds to me like the women of the Civil War era really championed this because they needed a place to say, hey, let's have a day of Thanksgiving, let's have a day of family renewal, let's have a day where we can come together for this fancy dinner and make sure that we are celebrating together as a family, because it's a horrible world out there. We're in the middle of a Civil War.
Yeah. And Deloria's point is that all this stuff about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans doesn't really get mythologized, doesn't really get developed until after the Civil War, late 19th, early 20th century, the same time when all those Confederate monuments were getting put up. So here's the tie back to Stowe and the issues that she was talking about. It's a time when the country was dealing with immigration, the country was dealing with all sorts of things, and enshrining these good old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ancestors seemed like a good way to kind of keep African-American people and all these new immigrants coming in their place, and tell them this is the ideal American. It's these wonderful pilgrims who then went on to slaughter many of the Indians that they had shared this Thanksgiving feast with, or at least their children.
Yeah, it's interesting to me with the information that the Wampanoag were actually coming to defend an alliance, right? A military alliance that they'd made. It casts both the original Thanksgiving party, whatever it was, and the period that Elizabeth is talking about, in which the celebration of American Thanksgiving are codified as somewhat these kind of exceptional moments within conflict, right? You set aside these spaces for some kind of peace amidst a kind of chaos. And then it seems like in the kind of recasting of this narrative, that context of war, of conflict, has been erased or sanitized, and instead we have just the feel-good peaceness, right? But the fact that this always happened precariously, and that the peace, whatever, breaking bread together, is not a lasting promise in any way. The image of heads on pikes is also one that I take strongly from this article, and the reminder that that in fact is a English tradition, right? That's a barbarism that is particularly Anglo.
Yes.
That parallel, it became really poignant for me to think about what that Thanksgiving space actually looks like, being thankful for maybe a moment rather than a whole lifetime of peace or something.
Kristen, if you want to read more on this subject, there's a book called The Pilgrim Reader by George F. Willison, which is kind of the standard. It was written, I believe, in the 50s. I'm looking to see what 1953, but it's still, talk to people that are in Boston and you know, they are there and still studying this and connected. This is the book that they'll point you to if you want to find out more information about what did these people think, what was really going on, as opposed to, again, overlaying, you know, 200, and now we're looking at, this is actually, we're coming up on what they're calling the 500 years of the Mayflower, because in 1620. And so there are actual sites out there, both in England and in the US, celebrating the voyage of the Mayflower. And it's been very interesting because in the US, they've been holding a lot of virtual chats with the Indian tribes that are still up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and you know what their view and take on the whole thing was, what their history is. So there's a lot of good information. You just have to kind of dig through a few layers to find it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Can you put the name in the chat of that book with the author? Awesome.
And there was a Native American writer in Harriet's day, 1830s and 40s, William Apess, A-P-E-S-S, who was a Native American himself, and he aligned with the Mashpee Indians or Native Americans in as they were in a legal battle over some of their land. He became an advocate for them. He wrote Son of the Forest, which is a brief autobiography of his experience as growing up Native American. And he also wrote about King Philip, as he was known, Metacomet, or the actual true Native American name that's given in the article, who was a great hero, the guy whose head wound up on a stake thanks to the settlers. He wrote a kind of heroic elegy for him in either in the 1820s or 30s. So
but John, you've got to remember, and as somebody who is a descendant of somebody who fought in King Philip's War, you have to put yourself in the context. So if it's being written that far removed as a monument to somebody, you always have to put a question mark and say, what was their motive and what really happened? And it's still, that's an area that, again, when you talk to the people in Boston, they're still heavily researching this. There's no definitive right or wrong. And so, you know, to say that my ancestors are bad, that's a perception.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Anybody else with responses to this article, or ways you can bring this up in your Thanksgiving conversations? Nobody wants to tackle that one.
I can pass along that if you really want to help people in Massachusetts and actually all along the eastern seaboard, go out and buy oysters right now because the restaurants have closed. The oyster market is really suffering, and so are these fishermen. So find some way to incorporate oysters into your dressing this year and help the fishermen.
It would be more traditional.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Would be. Well, my own Thanksgiving dinner looks like it's going to be a very small affair with just my immediate family and probably some Zoom drinks with a larger crowd of relatives. But since I have one son who is taking AP History, AP US History this year, and I was helping him with his concept cards a couple weeks ago, it was like King Philip's War. And I was like, I don't really know anything about King Philip or his war. And then this article came, I was like, King Philip, oh, right, that guy. So it just brought a couple points together. So maybe I'll have our young historian tell us the, he just walked into the room and is nodding no, but maybe I'll have our young historian tell us all about the first Thanksgiving. All right. It is after 8 o'clock and we don't have to end right away, but just if you have any closing ideas or thoughts that you want to get out, now would be the time to do so. And I will let John and Kristen take the lead on that.
Kristen, you want to go first?
I feel like I've been monopolizing this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think again, one of the things that I love about the 19th century is just the complexities that we continue to grapple with today around issues of equity, issues of diversity. They're all there in the 19th century. We've been tackling this stuff for a long time, and so there are moments I have a real identification in these readings, and there are moments of real kind of holding at arm's length that I have, and seeing those things simultaneously or sort of coexisting is just always it's instructive for me. It's a good reminder for me that sensation is one that has deep historical resonances as well as an experience that I have today in many circumstances too.
You talked earlier, my closing thought might be about your earlier comment about the conundrums that some of this seems very radical, some of it seems horribly old-fashioned, and I think Catherine and Harriet grappled with some of those conundrums themselves. I think they struggled with it. Here's Catherine giving all this wonderful advice about homemaking. She wasn't raising her own kids. She didn't have kids. She didn't even really have a home. She tended to live with her siblings at various times, but she was the great authority on what women should do in their homes. Harriet obviously was the prime breadwinner in her family. Her writing made a lot more money than Calvin's teaching or Calvin's writing, her husband, and she struggled with finding enough time to write. Sounds like Virginia Woolf here, wishing at one time that she wanted to have a room of her own so she could write and support the house, and that meant she had to have servants. When her sister wasn't living with her, she had servants to take care of the house. That's part of the interest in all the having better quality domestic. Good help is so hard to find. You can hear Catherine and Harriet lamenting about that in a kind of annoying way, but they wanted better servants. And there's a little bit of anti-immigrant bias, I think, that comes through in some of those statements too. All these Irish coming in and, can't depend on them. Though Harriet herself was very close to one of her Irish servants at one time. So I think they struggled with these things too. And maybe one of the best images, I think, that challenges us today is that I think both Catherine and Harriet, for all their disagreements about women's suffrage and all sorts of other issues, I think they both agreed that the family should be the model for society. for the kind of society they wanted. Now, you can say, well, that's maybe not the greatest model, but it certainly stands in opposition to the American individualism, to that whole push on individualism that is so strong in America, that the authors of that book, Habits of the Heart, identified as what makes us fundamentally American. And they saw that as dangerous if unbridled. Both Catherine and Harriet, and also the authors of Habits of the Heart, Robert Bellah and his cohorts. And I think, in our own troubled times, that's an image that we might all try to think about a little bit. Can the model of the family in some way, it's not a perfect congruence, but in some way, can it help to heal our society? Can we think about the people who are driving us crazy as somehow crazy members of the family, or something that we can, that we feel connected to, even when we disagree with them, and even when they're driving us crazy? Maybe that model, though it didn't catch on in the 19th century, and it hasn't caught on in our own time, maybe it's worth thinking about again. And I wish we could feel more connections with one another, not just on Zoom, but in a broader sense, that there's more of a social fabric that needs to be re-knit, I think, somehow. So maybe that's the ultimate challenge that Catherine and Harriet leave us with on these holidays, is how can we reweave the web that holds our family together and begin in some small way to weave or reweave, maybe just weave for the first time, that kind of web that would hold our country together. And I know I'm borrowing that metaphor of reweaving the web from feminist writers of a few decades ago, but I think it's still a very valuable metaphor. So I guess that's my holiday wish for people.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We have spent an hour and 15 minutes in lively discussion. So again, thank you all for coming this evening. Check out our website for more programming opportunities. There is one more Year of the Woman discussion series scheduled for December, it's the first Wednesday in December. I think it's December 2nd. It's the 2nd. And that is about Merry Abolitionist Christmas. So the readings are, I believe, already linked on our website, so you can take a look at those. And then John has some great things planned for next year as well. So more information about that will be on the website soon. Again, thank you all for coming this evening. And if anybody has additional questions or things that they need to know about the house, you know where to reach me, either through our website, or you can email at friends@stowhousecincy.org. So thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks everybody for a great discussion.
Thank you very much.